Hey, what's up? Jeff Lerner here. I want to talk to you today about grit. You know, I've been a student of success. What does it really take to do great things in this world for about 12 years now. I'm 40 years old. I was 28 when I decided I was tired of being broke and getting kicked around by this world. I was going to really commit myself to whatever it takes to be successful in this world. So 12 years I've been studying this. Frankly, I was studying it before I actually put it into practice. But like a lot of people, you hear things, you read things, but you don't really own them. You don't really internalize them and put them into practice until something happens. A lot of times you hit rock bottom or some switch just flips and you just say enough's enough, right? But anyway, in all my study and all my analysis of what it really takes to be successful in this world, there's probably not a word that better encapsulates what it really takes than this word, grit. Grit is like this amalgam of determination and passion and drive and pain tolerance. Whenever I think of grit, I think of sand and I think of Navy SEALs. The Navy SEALs, they train in the sand, they train in the cold water, and they get sand in their shoes and sand. I've read, books and by Navy SEALs about their training, and it's like the sand is ubiquitous. And I think about it because sand, that's what grit particles are, right? Little pieces of rocks and sand. There's something about that little thing that gets in there between the pieces and rubs and irritates, and you just endure and you press through. They actually have a test now called the grit test. They can test people and find out if they're gritty. They use this now in the military. They use it at West Point, and they can actually predict how successful people are going to be in officer training based on this grit test. This is a real thing. They put grit up against education. They put grit up against talent. They put grit up against physical attributes. They put grit up against anything in this world, and grit is always a better predictor of success than whatever they compare it to. I did a series of trainings last year called Lessons from Losers. People that had failed and then ultimately become successful. And if you look at all these people's lives, and we know these names, we study them, we revere them, guys like Richard Branson or Walt Disney, Henry Ford. Henry Ford went bankrupt 5 times before he started Ford Motor Company. Bill Gates, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Outliers, and in it he talks about Bill Gates. Like, Bill Gates had all these advantages, and it's like not fair that Bill Gates was so successful. BS. He didn't come out of the gate with Microsoft. Him and Paul Allen launched something called Trafo Data, which was like a device that interpreted traffic data, and it was a complete failure. The prototype didn't work. They took it to market, they sold it, they couldn't deliver it, it failed. They were laughed at. People said they were scammers. They went back to the drawing board, reinvented themselves, got back to work, started Microsoft, right? One of the richest guys in the world now. And what has he done with his money since he became one of the richest guys in the world? He's done probably more good, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, than anybody in history through charitable endeavors. This guy has grit, whatever you give this guy. I actually know somebody who's one of the first 10 people hired in an executive role at Microsoft. This guy is still close personal friends with Bill Gates. You hear people talk about Bill Gates, people that really know him. This guy is driven. This guy is maniacally driven to achieve and accomplish whatever he sets his mind to, and he's wicked smart. He's got grit. Stephen King, people are, greatest American novelist ever, sold all these books. Stephen King's first manuscript was rejected by publishers 30 times. Not once, not twice, 30 times. He finally got so mad he threw it in the trash, and he looked over, he saw his wife sitting there, his wife Tabitha. I've heard Stephen King talks about this. He said, Tabitha was sitting there. I said, I knew I couldn't quit. Got it back up out of the garbage pail and started writing again. He wrote by the way, Stephen King writes all his books by hand. You ever seen Stephen King books? They're like this thick, 600, 700, 800 pages. Guy's written tens of thousands of pages, small print. Wrote it all by hand on his notepads. Grit. That manuscript was rejected 30 times. Finally, he finished it, got it published. It went on to be Carrie, one of his first book, one of his best-selling books. It was made into a Hollywood movie, and it set him off on his path. Ben Franklin, like old school dude, no hair on the $100 bill, right? Had to drop out of school at 10 years old because back then there was no free public education and his parents couldn't afford to send him to school past 10 years old. I think this guy's one of the smartest people in history. He's a great writer, somebody who's synonymous with wisdom, educated himself entirely from the time he was 10 years old. This guy had grit. Do you have grit? Don't worry about anything else. Don't worry about if you have advantages. Don't worry if you know the right people. Don't worry if you went to the right school. Don't worry if you have all the money to get started with. A lot of times money's a burden. Money gives you the cushion to think that you can make mistakes that you really can't afford to make. Don't worry about all that stuff. Have you got grit? Are you willing to dig in, push through, and make it happen and do what it takes? There's actually a book called Grit. It's a good read, and there's a TED Talk if you like to. This is the great thing about the world we live in now, right? Somebody writes a great book, and you're like, I don't know, I don't want to read a whole book, because let's face it, most people don't read whole books now. Usually a great author ends up with a TED Talk. Go watch the TED Talk, right? They tell you what their book's about. Personally, I recommend you read the book. Get some grit, read a book, right? But if that's too much for you, go watch the TED Talk. This researcher, Angela Duckworth, she lays out, here's how you develop grit. These are the steps to developing more grit in your life. First of all, you have to define, what does grit look like in your life? For me, grit isn't carrying boats on Coronado Island like the Navy SEALs. Grit isn't defusing a bomb underwater. That's SEAL grit, but I don't have those needs in my life. What does my grit look like? Maybe grit for you is waking up early. Maybe grit for you is not missing a workout for 30 days in a row. Maybe grit for you is not eating after 6 p.m. Maybe grit for you is switching to a keto diet or a vegan diet. Maybe grit for you is telling your wife or your husband that you love them 4 times a day. Maybe grit for you is to actually do something nonverbal once a day to make sure they know that you love them, even without you having to say it. Maybe grit for you is spending more time with your kids. I don't know what grit for you is, but I know that if you define it, if you write it down, if you make very specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely, they call them SMART goals, grit definitions in your life, you're more likely to actually realize them because you've defined what they are, right? We can't hit the target that we haven't defined, we haven't identified, right? Next thing you got to do to develop grit is you got to start achieving small wins. Grit is something that becomes a momentum. It becomes a trajectory. It becomes simply a way of being in the world. It's like leaning in. It's like pressing forward, but you got to feel it. It has to be tangible. Grit is developed by something like, I am going to finish my work 2 days before it's due, and I'm going to physically hand it in. And I'm going to get the smile from my professor or my teacher or my boss or whoever, and I'm going to get the pat on the back of a job well done. Like, you have to physically experience these small wins. It's reinforced through tactile or emotional sensation. Grit is when you tell yourself that I'm going to come home early, I'm going to play with my kids, and that you pick them up and you feel the joy and they wrap their arms around you. Those sensations, you physicalize and you internalize. That's what becomes grit. Grit isn't just a whole bunch of intellectual decisions and something you just kind of think your way into, right? You got to go experience it, make it tangible in your life. And ultimately, grit comes down to habits. If you haven't read The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, that's Duhigg, got to read this book. This is not one where you can fast forward to the TED Talk. Read the book. You have got to develop good habits. The book talks about keystone habits. These are the habits that drive the rest of your habits and that are ultimately the predictors and drivers of success in your whole life. But ultimately, you've got to develop a few core habits that aren't so much about the result. They're about what you prove to yourself every day or every week or however often you repeat these habits. For me, it's getting up in the morning and working out. I get up before most people get up. I work harder than most people work before even most people are awake in the morning. And every day I start my day by proving to myself that I can do hard things that most people won't do. That's a habit that ultimately ripples through how I do everything. Because like they say, how you do one thing is how you do everything. Pick one thing, pick one habit, do it with excellence and consistency, and make that the keystone that carries into how you do everything else, all right? Go get some grit, my friends, and remember, life is meant to be awesome. If you like this kind of stuff, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel. I put out tons of videos like this all the time. I am obsessed with success. I'm obsessed with a belief that life is meant to be awesome, and helping myself and other people achieve that with as much consistency as possible. So go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you on the next video. Take care.